Good morning, everyone, and a big warm welcome to all of you at home joining us today. We'll be reflecting on Pope Francis's latest encyclical, Fratelli Tutti, and I'm quite pleased that you can't see mine very well on my camera here because you can't see that my bookmark is only about 2 chapters in. I'm wondering if there's some other people at home who haven't quite managed to read the full encyclical yet, but if not, we've got some experts with us here today who are going to talk about the encyclical and about the practical outworkings of some of that Catholic social thought that's included within it. So I'm really pleased today to be joined by Dr. Anna Rowlands. Hi, Anna.
Hi, great to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
Anna is the Associate Professor of Catholic Social Thought and Practice from Durham University and author of the book Catholic Social Teaching, A Guide for the Perplexed. We also have with us today Phil McCarthy, the CEO of CSAN, which is the Catholic Social Action Network. Hello, Phil.
Good morning. Thanks for inviting me.
And Neil Thorns, the Head of Advocacy, Communication and Education at CAFOD, the Catholic Agency for Overseas Development. Good morning, Neil.
Morning, everyone. Hi, thanks.
And just before we get started, just a couple of technical announcements. So during the session, you should be able to see on the right-hand side of your screen a question box. You can type in there any questions that you have for our panel here, and we'll feed them in during the session. If you have any problems seeing or hearing us, you can pop that in there as well. And my colleague Fulvio, who's off screen, will give you a hand with any technical difficulties. Hopefully we're all good to go. And the best way to start our session, I think, would be with a prayer. Have we got a prayer on screen, please? Let's join together in prayer. Lord, Father of our human family, you created all human beings equal in dignity. Pour forth into our hearts a fraternal spirit and inspire in us a dream of renewed encounter, dialogue, justice and peace. Move us to create healthier societies and a more dignified world, a world without hunger, poverty, violence and war. May our hearts be open to all the peoples and nations of the earth. May we recognise the goodness and beauty that you have sown in each of us, and thus forge bonds of unity, common projects, and shared dreams. Amen. Now, to introduce our session, Dr. Anna has very kindly videoed a message, an introduction to the encyclical, purely because your internet connection isn't great up there, is it, Anna? So Anna will be staying with us to answer questions and to be part of the discussion, but we thought it was safest to record the message beforehand. So let's go over to that now, and then we'll come back afterwards.
Good morning. I'm really delighted to be able to share in this CAFOD CSAN Reflection Day. So thank you so much for inviting me. I've worked with both organisations for over a decade now, and I'm hugely proud to be associated with the work of both. So I'm really delighted that this is a joint day of reflection on Fratelli Tutti. So what I want to do in the space of 10 minutes is just share with you some of my thoughts on the way in which Pope Francis offers a vision to our current world in the new document. And I'm going to do that by suggesting that there are 4 basic statements that the document makes, and that everything in the text can be read as flowing around those. And it's a sort of dramatic narrative, really, that the document offers us. You'll have your own readings, so this is meant to be a way of me sharing mine in the hope that you will then be able to engage your own interpretations of the text. So the first statement that I think the Pope wants to make, which is the framing statement of the whole document, is this: we need to see ourselves more and more as a single human family dwelling in a common home. So those 2 ideas, that we are a single human family, we are kin of each other, brother, sister, neighbour, friend. That's the language the document uses, scriptural language, to describe our relationships to each other. That's what comes first and foremost, and it becomes before the law of any nation or any other claim on us, that claim that we are a single human family. And the reality is that the earth is our common home. So that's that framing statement of vision, of universal fraternity, as the Pope calls it, is the first and most important statement of the encyclical. It's its vision. The second statement, however, is that almost everything the Pope thinks about our current economic, political, ecological model is pulling us away from that vision of being a single human family responsible for all in a shared home. So we seem to be in a moment where the basic truths about who we are that are revealed to us so clearly by COVID, as well as by the environmental crisis and our broader economic problems, everything in our system is pulling away from those truths rather than pulling us towards them. So the Pope is anxious about that misrecognition of our basic relatedness. So the third statement is then, okay, this is urgent. You know, the fact that this is our truth. We are a universal human family. Much in our system is pulling away from that vision of co-belonging and integration. So there is an urgent moment for a world on the brink. And the urgency that the Pope conveys in this letter, I think, cannot be understated. So what we need to do is learn to act differently, and we can only do that by acting together. This is not something individuals can achieve by themselves. It requires a form of what he calls social friendship in order to bring that change. So the final of my 4 statements is then the Pope recognises that this is a risky business, that this is a difficult call, but it's one that we can be confident in when we realise that we stand on the ground of our religious tradition. So this is unapologetically a religious text. It's rooted in a vision of a God who creates, sustains, redeems, and calls us to be participants in that act of creation and recreation. So the first statement, let's unpack that a bit. We need to see ourselves as a single human family. So the Pope argues that the vision of Scripture is really clear, that each person is born with equal worth, equal dignity, and a right to equal access to the goods of the earth. There's no reason why one part of the world, one nation state, one community, or one individual should have a prior call on more of those goods. The goods of the earth are created to meet human need and should circulate within that community as the basis, not just for survival, but also for human development, human creativity, and human flourishing. There's a kind of joyfulness in the vision of how the created goods of the world are meant to benefit all. This isn't just a sort of austere vision of nothing but survival, nor is it the politics of envy. So we're all related to all responsible for all dependent on all, and we're all beneficiaries when we focus on the well-being of all. So we benefit when others are well. The passage which is used, the scripture passage which is used as the framing for the whole document, is the story of the Good Samaritan. So the Good Samaritan, the Pope says, allows himself to be interrupted on the road between Jericho and Jerusalem. This is presented as a risky road, and the Pope draws from Martin Luther King's last speech before he was killed, in which he talks about the way in which that road had a curve on it that was probably very dangerous, and that this was a really risky act for the Good Samaritan to stop at that point. The Pope draws from Martin Luther King's message. But he also talks about the way in which the Good Samaritan doesn't act alone, but rather he forms social friendships, in this case with the innkeeper, who's able to take on the care of the wounded individual. So he doesn't act alone, he forms social friendships, but he allows himself to be interrupted, to pay attention to what is in front of him and the moral claim of that person. So he acts well with and for this individual. So it's about attention, it's about encounter, it's about dialogue. It's also for the Pope about being unafraid to approach the suffering of others, and to see that also as part of our own stories, to know that there's a law beyond the basic law of borders and ethnic groups. So the question that the Pope draws out from the Good Samaritan passage, which is how he sees Christ framing the passage, it starts with the question, who is my neighbour, which he sees as a question of limit. And the passage explodes that question and said, it's not about working out who is my neighbour and who isn't, but rather the onus is put back on the individual to say, how do I become a neighbour? So the question is one of human and neighbourly becoming in the passage. How do I become a neighbour? That's the challenge, and that's an expansive vision, therefore not one of limit. So the second statement I made at the beginning is, okay, so if so much of our current economic, ecological and political model is pulling precisely away from that vision, where does the Pope see the risks? So he talks profoundly about dark clouds over a closed world. That's how he titles this particular passage. And it's very clear that that broken, bleeding man by the side of the Jericho road that the Good Samaritan tends to is our world. It's the figure who expresses where we're at. So some of the signs that the Pope points to in the document are the treating of human life as superfluous, and he sees that in the context of the pandemic in the treatment of the elderly. He also sees very, very strongly, and this is a theme running through the whole document, the position of the migrant and the refugee as superfluous life, is treated as not having the same value. So the elderly, the disabled, those who are considered not to be economically productive, and migrants are particularly picked out as those who are seen as superfluous to our cultural needs, wrongly in the eyes of the Pope. He also talks about the politics of indignity and the way in which that expresses itself in work that lacks dignity, wages that fail to recognise dignity, and also obviously in the treatment of some of those groups that I've just noted. He also talks about two kind of logics which he thinks show a kind of spiritual malaise in the current world. One is a sort of logic of domination, that the only way to be in the world is to seek to dominate others. And he talks very movingly about the way in which self-esteem is removed from the individual by the process of being dominated by others. So this is a theme that St. Augustine talks about in the 5th century when he's writing about a crisis in Rome and in the Roman Empire, and he talks about the danger of being driven not by neighbour love of God, love of neighbour, but rather by a kind of lust for domination. That this is the difference between political virtue and political vice, is whether or not the lust for domination is the primary logic that drives action. And really interestingly, the Pope sees that lust for domination and control not only in the economic sphere or in the political sphere, but he also has a whole section in which he talks about digital communication and the online world. And in that context, he talks about the domination of particular market interests over social media. And he talks about a binary culture of likes and dislikes that comes to structure the way in which we sort of view the world morally, and the way in which he thinks that is not only superficial, but also hugely problematic. In terms of a kind of culture of encounter and dialogue, that there's very little in social media which has certain goods attached to it, but very little that promotes real dialogue and real encounter. So if sort of a lust for domination and a kind of simplification to this very binary culture of like and dislike, controlled by dominating economic interests, concerns him on the one hand, the other thing that concerns him is a kind of politics of despair, a refusal of hope, a refusal to believe that the world can be made and remade in a different way, that transformation is really possible. So he talks about that kind of almost cultural grief that we seem to live with, that so many people feel very distant from the kind of mechanisms of power in their own lives or within their regions, where they feel it is possible to see that kind of change. And he sees these as a kind of spiritual malaise or a spiritual disease, a virus in itself that affects the social body. So he has this wonderful and really interesting distinction that he draws throughout the letter between forces of social aggression, which run all the way through these different cultural aspects, our politics, our economics, our ecological relationship with the earth, our digital and social communications, and a model of what he calls social peace, which is what is the point for him of politics, society, and governance. So what builds social aggression? Where's that dominant in our reality? Social peace as an alternative. And he retrieves the idea at the end of the section where he talks about this vision of social peace, that we need to be a people, and the only way in which we become a people is to negotiate a life together. So he talks about the ways in which we need to refine our historical memory, our historical consciousness of who we are as communities and peoples, our rootedness in that, and also the way in which now we can negotiate with each other the kind of deep common loves that might form a community in a stable way. What are the truths that we learn about what it means to be human beings who flourish together? And how do we formulate law on the basis of locking in those goods, those sustainable goods that build communities of long duration and social peace? So it's the process of forming and becoming a neighbour, becoming human, becoming a people. And it's the process of becoming that he's interested in, what enables that interactive, dynamic process of encounter and dialogue so that we grow into those entities. So my third statement was, this is a moment of enormous challenge and opportunity. How do we reset our politics, our economics, our ecological order? How do we bring light into that darkness, openness in the context of what seems closed? So obviously COVID is a key theme of the document, and he talks about the way in which that illustrates these problems with real starkness. It forces us to confront who we are without illusion. So for him, the only future is a cooperative one. It requires a new form of openness and the building of communities of trust rather than distrust. It requires us to find new ways to share the goods of the earth, to distribute those for the goods of all, rather than them being held intensely in small pockets of wealth accumulation, for example. And he also talks about the way in which building any new process of social change, of renewed trust, of renewed community, means that we need to involve those whose lives are most affected by the sharp issues we face around the indignity of work, climate change, migration, those who are experts by experience in the failures of those current systems need to be involved as the ideas people who help generate. He talks about grassroots movements as the social poets who help us create those new futures. So there is no process that can be considered to be truly socially transformative that doesn't involve being with those groups in the process of seeking solutions and rebuilding communities for dignified work, for a just sharing of the goods of the earth, and for the protection of human life. So finally, I said this is an unashamedly religious document. It's the first social encyclical to be born out of an interfaith encounter, in this case with the Grand Imam. And he talks about the ways, interestingly, in which religion gets things wrong as well as right. So he talks about the way in which religion has sometimes been on the side of injustice rather than justice, and that there is a need for active repentance on the part of religious communities for the ways in which they have abused power or failed to challenge structural social injustice and legitimated it. He talks about the way in which faith is a gift, however, that allows us to, in a sense, be open to the grace of the road ahead. That comes from recognizing that there is a common creator across all faith traditions, and that we can only find our good through each other, that there is this recognition core to religious traditions, that our good is found by moving beyond ourselves into an encounter with God and with the other. We're not solely responsible for this task. There is an active spirit at work in the world who we consent to work with, and that means that we're participating in a plan, a divine plan for the Pope that lies in the hands of God, who makes crooked paths straight, brings healing to that broken body on the Jericho Road. What we're being called to do is to participate in that vision.
Wonderful. I think we might have lost Anna just as we had her video on. So sorry about that, Anna. I'm sure you're trying to get back, or maybe you're there on microphone. Are you there, Anna? We'll carry on trying to get Anna back, and we'll continue our discussion with Phil and Neil. So a lot to think about there in that video. One of the things that comes in the introduction to Fratelli Tutti, and which Anna mentioned there, was Pope Francis's talk of dark clouds over the world. I think we're all pretty familiar with those dark clouds at the moment, but I wonder, could you tell me what has been a light shining through the dark cloud for you over the last few months? Would you like to start, Phil?
Yes, thanks, Eileen. I think for me, one of the things that shone through over the last few months, and which has raised my heart, has been to see the way that the many charities who are members of the network have really adapted to providing their services to those in need in very difficult times. So they've been hit by a real storm of reduced income, increased need, new needs, sometimes fewer volunteers, sometimes fewer paid staff. But despite that, they've managed to innovate and to and to really carry on serving those most in need. And a concrete example of that I would give is the case of Caritas Anchor House, which provides accommodation, education and rehabilitation in the East End of London, an area with very high incidence of homelessness. And they've managed to adapt their services to keep their people safe. And during the time of lockdown, they've had no one seriously ill, no one who's died. And to manage that for homeless people is an extraordinary achievement. So I think there are many of our charities who are achieving similar things for their staff and that for their people they serve. And that's a really enormous lift to our spirits during these difficult times. The other thing which has really struck me is the collaborations which we've had. So we had a very good collaboration with the Society of St Vincent de Paul, the SVP, to produce a COVID toolkit to help parishes and conferences reach out during these times, and that's been wonderful. And I think it's also great that we're working together as CSAN and CAFOD as the two sister agencies for Caritas agencies for England and Wales. It's not something we've done before, but here we are doing it even in these difficult times. So those are the things that have cheered me.
Wonderful, thank you, Phil. I don't know if you have similar ideas, Neil, or something else cheered you?
Yeah, I think to build on what Phil says, I think just as he uses the illustration of Anchor House, I see the illustration of what's happened in some of our partner countries. So, for example, in Bolivia, where people were still facing the threat of the pandemic, and people were still facing food. Often the way that the pandemic illustrated itself was much more through food rather than a health crisis. But actually in Bolivia, for example, you had the Caritas agency in Bolivia providing support for those who are most in need, and who people would kind of might ascribe to being the undeserving poor. So that would be prisoners, or that may be migrants, or people who were generally seen to be kind of almost nuisances, in terms of draining resources. But the Caritas people put themselves out there very much, and provided that kind of food and hygiene support for them daily, which I thought was absolutely incredible. And if I can just give one other, a joking example, the thing that shone a light for me is the American election, just because that was fantastic news. But joking aside, it made a huge difference, because actually I think one of the things which shone a light for me in this period was the fact of people reconnected. So just, I think, as Phil said about people coming together in different ways, I think people reconnected with nature, they reconnected with their communities, whether that was through the mutual aid societies about providing support for maybe the vulnerable people in your street. But I think the important thing that it connected with was nature and kind of the things around you. And as Anna said in her talk, one of the things that Pope Francis says in this document and has been consistent about is the fact of, the pandemic is here, but don't forget the climate crisis, which is just kind of an ongoing sense for us. And I think that's where, as I say, the change in the kind of US election actually gives us hope, because actually it means that hopefully coming out of the pandemic, we can be stronger together, but we can also be stronger in terms of thinking about how we take care of nature and God's creation around us. Eileen, you're on mute.
Thank you. How unprofessional of me. It happens to everyone sometimes. I was just saying it's wonderful to have you back with us, Anna. Fantastic you could make it back in. We were just talking about the dark clouds over the world, and what might have been a light shining through those clouds for us over the last few months. Is there anything that you'd like to add?
Yeah, I think certainly in the earlier phases, just a remarkable community spirit of people being willing to find ways to connect with each other and to meet need. And one of the things that actually in my own area of work, in a really small way, there's been a huge amount of community outreach in the Northeast, and particularly to some of those who are most vulnerable. But I teach in a university setting, and just the desire of students to seek to communicate with each other, to find ways to connect. And actually, in some ways, an online learning platform has made new forms of communication possible, so that we have been able to connect our students with far reaches of the world and places they would not normally be in connection with. And also I've found that students have been much more willing to draw on their own background, their class background, their experiences. So there's been a kind of openness and vulnerability and trust that's been built in that space. And I think those things are things that I'd like to see continue afterwards.
Wonderful. Yeah. It's interesting that that Pope Francis kind of criticises social media, and I know he does it in a balanced way, but we do see some good of it as well. We see that we're able to all be here together in this online room today from all over the country and probably the world to hear and discuss these things, which is a wonderful blessing, isn't it? I was thinking about what Phil and Neil said. You were both reflecting on that kind of grassroots support, so the help for homeless people in East London from Anchor House, and I know I've had our colleagues from the CAFOD Brazil team online with me, and they've talked about feeding homeless people in Brazil as well. Sometimes in our media and even talking to people, you hear this idea of, oh, charity begins at home. Why do we have an aid budget overseas when there's so much we need to concentrate in our own country? As leaders of an international aid agency and UK charity, do you see a rivalry there, or how do you approach that issue?
Shall I start, Neil? I think that, as I said earlier, we are sister Caritas agencies. We're part of the same global confederation, so it'd be very odd if we saw ourselves competing. And I think what I'd like to see is that we're working together to make sure that acting both locally and globally becomes part of the mission of every Catholic parish and the vocation of every Catholic, and really valued as a core part of our own mission and our own vision for society. So I think it's the bringing together of the global and the local, which runs through Fratelli Tutti, but here we're trying to actually act it out in concrete terms.
I'd agree completely, Phil. I think people often make the question about kind of here or overseas in terms of the aid budget, and that's not how you approach the aid budget. And I think people have been writing in the questions about the taking away the money from the aid budget and into military spending. And I think it's a really obviously very pertinent topic, today as we think about it, and that kind of reversal of, turning swords into plowshares. Actually it's turning plowshares into swords, which is, deeply depressing. And it's not a choice of either or. It's a question, I think, of, just as Phil said, the local and the global. But also I think we have to think morally about where a lot of our wealth has come from in this country. A lot of our wealth in this country has come from the fact that we had an empire, the fact that we have used fossil fuels. We were the first country to industrialize. We were the heart of the Industrial Revolution. And so actually the impact that we've had on the climate crisis has been huge. We are, I think, something like the 6th or 7th biggest historic emitter of carbon. So actually we have a duty as well. It's a moral duty in terms of what our aid budget does to help our brothers and sisters around the world for some of the things that we have created in this world. So, and just to be really very clear about it, when we hear potentially with the Prime Minister talking about taking money from the aid budget into the military spending, the Ministry of Defence has overspent by £13 billion. That dwarfs, in terms of the amount that will come out of the aid budget and putting into it. So I think there are very hard questions to be asked. And if you want to do something, I know as some people have said, is to, especially if you are in a Conservative constituency, write to your MP now, tweet them, email them, him or her, or else send a message directly into the Prime Minister, either through social media or that, because it is a very live issue, and I think it's good for people to raise their voice about it.
Wonderful. I've got a message from Ben online as well. He says, so helpful, the video, Anna, and wondered, could you say a bit more about social friendship, social aggression, social peace, and social poets?
Yeah. Can you hear me? Because it keeps saying my microphone's off. You can hear me. Okay, great. Just a couple of things if I can. The first is just on that previous question. I think what's really interesting about Fratelli Tutti is it makes clear that the idea there is an either or competitive logic between the local and the global is already a chosen mindset. It's not a natural assumption, it's a political one, and we can choose whether we adopt that or not. And the choice of the document is to reject it and to suggest that there is one world, and within that world there is a particular division of the created goods of the earth, which are meant in their createdness for the benefit of all. And when those goods, which belong to the needs of all and are there for the flourishing of all, are not accessible, then we have a problem. So we face a major crisis of distribution of goods and access to goods globally, and also of the participation that is possible of people in the light of those goods. So there is simply no question of an either or for the document. So that's just the first thing to say. In terms of social friendship and universal fraternity, I think these ideas are really interesting in the text. The papal encyclical has not used this phrase social friendship before. And I think what the Pope's trying to do is to say, there's a vision behind this document, and the vision is universal fraternity. We all are related to all, responsible to all, of equal worth, and we benefit when everybody else benefits. That's the vision point. How do you put that vision into action? Social friendship. So social friendship becomes the principle that makes the vision operational. And that's also the relationship between the stuff he talks about in terms of the global and the local. So the global is the universal level, and the local is this tangible, embodied level, because we can't live in the abstract. We can only live in bodies and places and times. So social friendship is what we do, it's what we build, it's what we benefit from, and that's what happens at the most local level. But it relates to a mindset that explodes into that universal.
Wonderful, thank you. And it's interesting. It sounds so beautiful. And you talk there about how we live in real life and in practicalities. So I was wondering, I guess all of us are here today because we believe in social peace and in social friendship. But as you mentioned, social aggression is throughout our culture. So sometimes it can feel like our own actions are a bit insignificant. I just wonder, what's your prognosis for the world? Can our small actions really make a difference?
Yeah, I mean, again, I think that the Fratelli Tutti is really clear that our world is built up of micro encounters. And movements like Black Lives Matter, Me Too movements, various of the ecological movements are precisely about those micro interactions, about those details. And Pope Francis is really clear that you start with the most local, not meaning that there's a priority for the local over the global, but you start with the immediate sets of relationships that you have and you build outwards. So his use of the Good Samaritan passage is to say, look, this is really interesting because it's bookended with somebody asking Jesus this question: how do I sort of limit who has a call on me? Who is my neighbour? In other words, also, who can I excuse and say isn't my neighbour? And by doing that, he says, okay, look, this is the wrong question. So the question is, how do I become a neighbour in ever expanding circles of generosity? And social friendship in the most local, micro, practical ways becomes a ripple effect that enables us structurally to then build a more expansive form of social friendship outwards from that. So he's absolutely clear that it's concrete, it's local, it's specific, but it's not individualistic. It is about working with structures and systems insofar as one has power and agency to do that, because those institutions and those structures are part of his vision of social friendship, not separate from it.
Wonderful. And I wonder, Neil and Phil, do you have any insights into that as well? I mean, you're working day to day with those structures and trying to build social friendship. Neil, would you like to go first?
I mean, I thought that was a great answer, Anna. I think in terms of the social friendship, I mean, maybe if I can kind of slightly answer it a different way, I think one of the things which the Pope is very clear about also is as Anna talks about, the kind of local solutions as well. So he's very clear, whether it's from the social movements or indigenous groups, that they hold the answers to a lot of our problems that we see in front of us. And that's not just to go to them for problems, but for the answers, sorry, but that's to involve them in the discussions and the participation, and to have those people at the kind of center of the table. And I think we can do that, whether that's in terms of the answers to how we, some of the lessons that we can take from the indigenous groups who work in the Amazon or elsewhere, but also ourselves. Actually we know our communities, and we know how we can make a difference in our own lives, whether it's about just caring for our neighbor or whether that's about the climate crisis. And I think we have to kind of continue that sense of the social networks. And, it's interesting, I think, in these times that actually, rather than, I think for a lot of people have become more expansive rather than isolationists. We've seen our governments in many ways become more isolationist, but I think in many people, because we're in a space, it's allowed us to connect with lots more other people in ways, for example, seeing mass from all over the world. You're not necessarily seeing the service from your own local church, and being able to kind of choose, if you like. So as a very simple way of kind of, connecting across borders. And I think that's the thing which I reflect on also from ourselves and CSAN. Often we kind of, CAFOD is seen to be overseas and CSAN is seen to be kind of domestic, but actually that line blurs so much for us, and we have constant kind of conversations about that, because actually when you see whether it's migrants and refugees coming from, the countries we work in and coming through Europe, and the fantastic work that CSAN agencies are doing here, but also just some of the same issues which are reflective in the UK are very similar to or have the same roots and causes as the ones overseas as well. So that's why I think it's really, we have a very strong relationship between us, but it's that social friendships, as Anna said, which is really crucial to it.
Mm. Wonderful.
And just to comment slightly further, I think one of the distinctive things about many of the charities and art network is they try to move constantly beyond the relationship which is between service provider and service user, and try to genuinely encounter people and where they are, and try to bring something of that social friendship into the relationships which they gradually build, and sometimes over very long periods, because our charities are often long established and well embedded in their local communities, their local parishes, and so on. And that does give a chance for building up that social capital on which the social friendships depend.
Wonderful. And we've had some questions about politics as well, and despair in politics. I know that that in chapter 5, Pope Francis calls for a better kind of politics. So bridging that kind of local and that political structure. Can you tell us a bit about how CSAN are doing that?
In terms of changing the politics of our world, I think,
politics that works better, I guess, for the common good.
Yeah, I think the way that we've tried to interact over the last many years has been always respectfully, so to understand that politics, whatever the difficulty, is a high vocation, and to try and respect people from right across the spectrum and to work with them. So I think that's really important. But what we've tried to do is to bring the voices of the poor into that conversation, not just it be people like myself or people who have some expertise in social policy, but also those who have real expertise through lived experience of the problems, whether it be homelessness or whatever it is. And examples of that would be, in 2018 we did a document called Embodied in Me, and we did some research with young people who'd arrived from distant countries and were living in Cardinal Hume Centre in London, and had no place to go, no home. And so their experiences were highly relevant. And we did a similar thing in 2019 with people who were living in care homes. So once again, it's those voices, those forgotten voices, that we are trying to bring to the political discourse, those that are not always heard.
Okay, wonderful.
And I think that the same would be true of us, when we, in a sense, more on maybe on the international scale. So whether it's talk around how businesses can be more accountable in terms of the human rights abuses along the kind of supply chains that they have, or whether it's, as I've talked about, the impact of the climate crisis on poor communities. So having those voices into, whether it's the meetings of the UN or meetings with the UK government, I think is absolutely crucial for us in terms of, and we're able to do that because of the support that the Catholic community gives CAFOD. You know, we're an enabler in a sense in some of those voices because of it. But if I can give one other illustration also from our work, which I thought was really, it kind of gives hope as well, I think. In El Salvador, there was a temporary ban brought in on mining for many reasons, because of the impact on people, but because of lots of other stuff as well. And actually, some of the Archbishop and other faith leaders really took that issue up and thought actually this was a really good thing to build on. And they managed to work with politicians. And actually, El Salvador is one of the first countries, and I think it's the first country in the world, to actually ban mining on gold and other metal, because they wanted to keep those precious resources in the ground. They didn't want a kind of an extractivist politics, if you like, coming out of it. And I do have a quote, which I just wanted to read from the Archbishop. He said, "We are representing the feelings of the population who want to protect the environment. What interests us is the common good. We can't pass on a contaminated country to our sons and daughters, to our grandchildren, and to future generations." So it's very much about how do we support our partners who are there every day trying to kind of build a better politics, you know, whether that's through accountability, whether that's through kind of concrete actions like that, but getting their kind of voices at the forefront, I think is really important. And also just to say, you know, we shouldn't forget that the way that CAFOD supporters engage with their local MPs. It's really important for people to have that culture of encounter, whoever your MP is. You know, that's the thing which, again, Fratelli Tutti is really clear about. You have that encounter, and hopefully you're all both enriched by it, and through that dialogue we see change coming. So again, really important to engage with your whether it's MPs, council leaders, whoever, but yeah, really important.
Yeah. Wonderful. That's really interesting. It answers a few people's questions as well, I think, online, asking about that. How do we bridge the local and the political structures? I've got a question from John as well online, who says, how do we get the core messages of Fratelli Tutti and Laudato Si to parishes, clergies, and the wider community? For example, interfaith. Well, it's quite a big question, John, but I wonder if the panel have any ideas from their own parishes or from the work that you do about how to get parishes excited about Catholic social thought.
Who would you like to go first?
I can tell you.
It's a difficult question, isn't it? And of course, we're doing it today. You know, this is part of this process. And if people come away from this webinar enthused and try and start off a reading group in their own parish, then this webinar this morning will have a dramatic effect. And I know it's being recorded and it could be used, particularly at the start. So we're doing it now, and I think we can't achieve everything overnight. It's a long and difficult process, as the Pope says in the document. But we are doing it. And I'm sure that this event, and many like it around the country, will carry on and will have dramatic effects on our society, I hope.
Wonderful.
Anna, do you want to? I was going to say something, but please feel free.
Yeah, I mean, it is always a challenge to get people to read an 80-odd page document that's written in a certain kind of style. So one of the things we need to do is actually diversify the kind of resources that come out from the document, so that people can encounter the themes of it in many different ways that connect with their own working, their own personal, their own church lives. But there is huge amounts of material in this document. And one of the things, when I was in Rome around the time of the launch of the document and involved in that, and I had the opportunity to talk to the Pope and some of the people who've been involved in drafting the document. And they are very clear that this is meant to be a document with what the Pope calls many doorways into it. So it's not meant to be like reading an essay or reading an academic document or a policy text. It's meant to be a reflection on the state of the world now with real urgency, where there are many different pathways in, and the Pope doesn't care how you find a way into the document. He just wants you to find a way in which it connects with your reality, whether that's because you care desperately about political structures, whether it's because you're interested in dialogue, in interfaith encounter, whether it's that you've got a passionate concern around the environment or inequality, whether it's just that you feel quite lost and despairing in your own lives and you want something that gives you a sense of hope and imagination for a different kind of future, that you're hungry for that in a world where there are few ideas at the moment. So he wants you to see it as a document with many doorways and just to find your own way in and lead others as you go.
That's a much better answer. Mine was very simple, was in the sense that CAFOD's going to be producing some resources to kind of engage. So like with Laudato Si, we produce some resources, especially the children's animation, which don't be put off by why I say it was children's, because it was absolutely fantastic and was really, really popular as just as an introduction. And equally we'll be doing one about Fratelli Tutti, but that's not to take away from what Anna says in terms of, finding your own space into it. I think it's really important.
Just one other thing to say, which is I don't think it matters so much that people read the entire document or study it as a forensic text. The invitation of the document is to allow yourself to be interrupted, to pay attention to what you see around you, and to engage in dialogue, particularly with those who are different from you. So actually practicing that and spreading that as a practice is the most important thing that can be done as a response to the document.
Wonderful. We do have a couple of questions online actually about that global dialogue. So whether it's in light of COVID or in light of greater restrictions on movement of people, we've got questions from Kevin and from Mark saying, how do we build that social friendship, and how do we have that global dialogue and encounter in a world where borders seem to be a greater barrier to the freedom of movement of people? Neil, you're the international person, so why don't you go first?
I'm not sure this is going to be the answer to the question, but can I make a shameless plug about how important next year is going to be in terms of this stuff? So actually, when we talk about COVID and the recovery from this pandemic, you see the huge amounts of money which is being spent, in this country and overseas, around the world. It is so absolutely fundamentally important how that money is spent going forward, because does that money get spent in a business as usual frame, or does it get spent to actually have at its heart the well-being of people, the poorest communities? Does it start to try and address the inequalities in our world? All the things which Pope Francis has talked about consistently, either in Laudato Si or in his commission, and equally, just as Anna said, in terms of taking us through Fratelli Tutti and taking away some of those kind of the mindsets that we have in it. Next year is going to be absolutely crucial because we have the G7 coming to the UK. So probably the first visit of the American president to the UK. We also have the climate talks happening in Glasgow next year, around this time, a year from now, and lots of other things around it. So actually, this is such a good year to be engaging with how you want the world to be reshaped. Pope Francis says, don't plan for the future, plan the future. So actually be active in this kind of space. So that's one way of doing it. Just get involved. There's lots of activities which will be coming up, and please get involved.
Absolutely.
Thanks, Neil. Should I go next? I think Neil said he was going to be shameless, so I may as well be too. And just talk briefly about community sponsorship of refugees, which I think is one of the ways that, and the photo comes out brilliantly, of Samir there in Salford, and who was settled by St Monica's parish, and now very happily running his own restaurant. And I think it's those sorts of encounters that really make a difference to people, where people turn in, and it's where they feel under threat and they think that things are out of control. But if people can actually be involved in welcoming a refugee family into their community, it can be transformational, not just for that family, but for the community. Once again, I'd echo what Neil says, get involved. At the moment, resettlement is paused, but please God, it will restart soon.
I think one of the things, Eileen, that's interesting about the language, which is very provoking language deliberately that the Pope uses, is he talks about an open borders world. And by that, he doesn't mean that no nation state may ever have a border. What he's saying is that a Christian imagination is an open borders imagination. And to be Catholic is to believe in an open borders world. So we are an open borders organisation, and we work in a world which has territorial borders. And those territorial borders need to be made to work so that they facilitate the flow of ideas, of people, and of goods, so that the common good is built in that context. So that requires an open borders organisation, the Church, to resist wherever it sees borders frustrating dialogue, encounter, the sharing of goods, and the encounter between persons. So the ability of the Church to cooperate with others, and this document's absolutely clear that this is not about the Catholic Church attempting to do this alone, but it's about it playing its own part and being a catalyst for change alongside others, with a degree of humility that we do this alongside other agents and agencies. That's the space that we need to be inhabiting imaginatively. And in a world of closed borders, it means an active resistance to all of the things that frustrate the vision of this document. It will require an age of resistance.
Okay, what form does that resistance take?
Well, it takes the form of enacting the opposite of all of those things. And again, this is why the document poses open borders, closed world. So what it wants to see is resistant practices that open out, that expand. So all of these places that narrow down to focus on simply the individual, simply on the nation state, simply on one economic system or way of containing things, all of those things have to be resisted by practicing the opposite.
Wonderful.
So can I just one very practical example of that, and I hate to kind of take that richness and put it into a very kind of short kind of political kind of narrow space. But for example, the UK has to come up with its nationally determined contribution for how it builds up into the Paris Agreement, the climate agreement. And so each nation state does that. Now, each nation state can either take a very narrow view of that in terms of either its emissions reductions or its money, or actually it can take a take on it, just as Anna has outlined there, in terms of saying, this is not about our nation doing this. This is about what's our contribution to the whole world, to the kind of common home. And actually, that's the way that the UK should be approaching our upcoming NDC, which will be published in December, thinking about actually what's the biggest contribution we can make to our common home. We're a very wealthy country. We've caused a lot of the damage. What is that kind of contribution, and how do we view it in that way, rather than, oh crikey, what can we get away with in our country? It's going to be tough. It's going to be tough. Actually, it's that sense of doing it as part of the common good, and every country must approach it in that way.
What makes Fratelli unusual as a document is that it goes from the mindset question. So it's telling people, be very careful, because your mindset, your imagination is being shaped by the narratives and the messages you hear every day. So have an imagination that is able to think global, that's able to think that change and transformation is possible rather than simply despair. So remember, it's about a mindset. But it also has really practical things to say. So what does it look like on the ground? It looks like those questions of redistributing wealth. It looks that Neil's been talking about. It also means things like humanitarian corridors for refugees. It means humanitarian visas. It means community sponsorship. So the document moves from the very practical in sections of what it means to cut against a closed borders world, to watch out, because the biggest question is the one of imagination. It's the script we tell ourselves.
That's wonderful. That's interesting, really interesting to think about what script we tell ourselves and how we can kind of turn that on its head as well to build a better world. I've got a question here from Raymond, and it's a slightly different topic to what we've been talking about, but I feel like we can't talk about Fratelli Tutti without addressing this. And Raymond says, brilliant talk, Anna. What about the criticism from some that Fratelli Tutti lacks the voices and insights of women?
Yeah, so there's two things that can be said about that. One, there's a wrangle over the language itself. I think the language of the actual title is a slightly less significant issue than the total absence of women's voices in the document itself. So there's a question about whether Fratelli Tutti, when it's translated from the modern Italian, really means brothers and sisters all anyway. And there's a question about how you deal with St. Francis of Assisi, who didn't use inclusive language. So there are genuine questions about that. But I think the bigger issue is this document talks about risky peace building. Who are the people who are involved globally in that risky peace building? Very often they are women, and they find themselves on the front line of that social peace building, both in terms of the theory of that, but also putting their own bodies in those spaces and coming up with extraordinary results in some instances. And so what's missing is the example of women as the social poets who give birth to new possibilities of social peace. So I think, there needs to be a major lesson for the Vatican in thinking about the next document. And I think in any dissemination work that we do as Catholic organisations, we must put those voices back in. I'm involved at the moment in collecting together a series of women who are experts on CST in a single volume on Fratelli Tutti, so that some of those voices will speak and be accessible to others. But I think we need to factor that absence back in anything that we take responsibility for doing.
Could I just comment on that? And I'm nervous to do so as a man. But I was reflecting on the central narrative of Fratelli Tutti, which is the Good Samaritan. And what's missing in that Good Samaritan story is, of course, women's voices. There are no women in that story. But actually, the wounded man was hanged over at the inn. And who looked after that wounded man? You can bet it wasn't the innkeeper. So it would have been the innkeeper's wife, daughters, and possibly female servants. And so often, voices of carers, who are generally, like peacekeepers, most often women, and often unpaid, those voices are unheard.
Well, they're written out. They're written out of the story. And so
I think there's something important about the deep narrative, which are there in all our structures that we need to try and address. And it sounds like Anna is making a very positive contribution there already. So.
Just to say, and we need to be very clear that there's a mirroring here between what society does, which is it has a problem with the agency of women still, and what this document does. So this isn't just a church problem. This is a problem about the position of women in relation to justice, poverty, war, migration. The list can go on. And what happens when the church comes to try and reflect on those things. Both are a problem. This is a problem for the world. It's a problem for the church.
Neil, I don't know if you wanted to add anything, or
my only contribution is the fact of when I've been lucky enough to travel for CAFOD, or in fact when I've been working, in international development, it is always women who are at the forefront either of peace. They are the ones who are way beyond where the road finishes. It's the sisters, it's the women. So and that's where most development agencies, and certainly CAFOD, would always put the issue of kind of gender right at the heart, because if you focus and you deal with kind of concentrating on the women, then you know that the rest of the community will benefit, and that's the way that you do good kind of development going forward.
Okay. Wonderful. Well, this has been a really interesting discussion, and we've had so many questions. I'm really sorry to anyone whose question we didn't get to, because we're out of time now. We said we'd meet for 1 hour, but if there's questions left there, we'll review them afterwards and be able to get back to you on any specific questions you had. We've had lots of thank yous in the question box as well, and saying that your talk was inspirational, Anna, and that personal stories make a difference. This is a clear message that's coming through, and some ideas there as well for how we can all share the message of this encyclical within our parishes and our communities. So thank you everyone for being with us. If you'd like to join us on some future online talks, check out cafod.org.uk/online talks, and you'll see some of the things coming up. We've got a lot of opportunities coming up to reflect and pray over Advent. And I know that CSAN, if you look on the CSAN website, you can find opportunities to sign up to their newsletter as well and keep in the loop of all the things that CSAN are up to. But thank you so much to our panel. Thank you very much for being with us today. It's been really fascinating. And take care, everyone. Goodbye.
Thank you.
Bye.